Good evening, and welcome to the post-film discussion for Nationtime. It's such a wonderful film, and I'm excited that we were able to share it with you this evening. I'd like to welcome our distinguished panel this evening, and I'll introduce them here in a second. My name is Russell Roots, and I am the Community Outreach Manager with the Utah Film Center. So I'm going to turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves quickly, and then I'm going to do a quick chronology of where this film is from, what kind of climate it was in, and then really bringing us to today, what this film means. So I'd like to start off with the person who really is kind of the reason for this season. Let's start with Miss Betty Sawyer. Could you please introduce yourself?
Thank you, Russell, and good evening, everyone. I'm Betty Sawyer. I am the president of the Ogden branch of the NAACP, the nation's oldest civil rights organization, and I'm the director of Project Success Coalition, who brings you and have brought you the Utah Juneteenth Freedom and Heritage Festival for the past 32 years. Glad to be with you.
Thank you, Betty. I'd like to also turn it over to Representative Sandra Hollins. Sandra.
Good evening. I'm Utah State Representative Sandra Hollins. I represent District 23, which is the northwest side of Salt Lake City, and I've been in office since 2015.
Thank you, Sandra. I'd also like to turn it over to James Evans. James, please.
Good evening. Thanks for having me. I'm James Evans. I served in the Utah State Senate as the first Black Republican state senator, and also chaired the Utah Republican Party at the state level for 4 years, and I'm just glad to be here.
Thank you. I also like to turn it over to Miss Darlene McDonald. Darlene.
Hello, good evening. I'm Darlene McDonald. I am a local author and activist. I am also the DNC National Committeewoman for Utah. I am honored to be here.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Byron Russell, please. Byron.
Thank you, Russell, and thanks for having me. I serve as the Utah Multicultural Commission co-chair, and I also serve continually, hopefully not for too much longer, the co-chair of the Utah Multicultural Committee of the COVID-19 response. And I've recently joined an economic task force team analyzing access to capital for our communities. And most important, I'm a member of the board of the Utah Film Center.
Thank you, Byron. And thank you to everyone. So tonight we are covering the film Nationtime, which was a documentary by William Greaves, who was also the executive producer of Black Journal from 1972. And it's a deep dive into the political and economic aspirations of the Black community from that period of time, which was actually quite a tumultuous period. Now, for those that were not familiar with what led to that period of time and what was represented on screen during the film, I wanted to give a quick chronology to really kind of help bring you up to speed. So at the beginning of the film, you started off with a really great discussion by Richard Hatcher, who was the first elected Black mayor of a large US city. That was in 1967. So we're starting just a few years before the film takes place in 1972. In 1968, you have some very big moments. You have the assassination of Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy. You have Lyndon Baines Johnson announcing that he's not seeking a second term. And then you also have the Democratic Convention in Chicago that erupts into utter chaos, which leads to the arrest of numerous anti-Vietnam War protesters and Black Panther co-founder Bobby Seale, who was also in Nationtime. So you step forward from 1968 to 1961, stepping forward from 1968 to 1971, you have Shirley Chisholm, who was the first Black woman to run for the Democratic nomination of the US presidential office. And then you step forward from 1971 to 1972, which is when the Gary National Convention takes place. And then from there, you step to 1975, which is when the Vietnam War ends. So the Gary National Convention is also taking place during the tumultuous time of the anti-Vietnam War protests. And then I want to step very, very far ahead, because this film is lost after 1972 when it airs, and it's not rediscovered until 2018, which is when someone happens to find it in a Pittsburgh warehouse and gets it into the hands of the Hollywood Foreign Press, Jane Fonda, and the others who begin the restoration process, who were able to re-release it for us to watch it today. So it's a fascinating journey to go from where we started to where we are today. But again, I want to step back and get just a little deeper into what happened in 1972. Miss Betty, can you tell us about what you were doing in 1972 and what your memories were of the political climate and that presidential election?
1972, those are some great times in a lot of ways. I was a sophomore at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. At the time, it was Morgan State College. And as most college campuses, our HBCUs were very politically active at that time. And so during those 70s, during the early 70s, again with Shirley Chisholm running on a major party, we were all elated and looking how we could help, whether stuff envelopes or go stick signs in people's yards or whatever it took. And at the same time, there was this dichotomy of wondering, will it make a difference? Will we ever get to have a Black person be president? And all of that coming at the same time. Vietnam War, that was a big thing on our campus, and the concern that, a lot of Blacks were the first ones to go to the front line. So we were even protesting on campus about that and talking about how do we get more young men in college so that they don't have to worry about the draft. And we're hearing stories from family members and friends back home who had lost loved ones in Vietnam and all of that. So it was a very, very interesting and active time politically. And just like any other college campus, a lot of it centered around the music at the time too. So everyone we were listening to were singing songs about what was going on at that particular time. And that gave us even more energy and impetus to stay involved.
Wonderful. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you look at historically, like films like Black Power mixtape, and you really look at the historical significance that music played through the Black protest struggle. And I think, it still plays right up on through today. For those of you who are not as well seasoned as Miss Sawyer, what were your greatest takeaways from this film? Step in, let's see, James, what were your thoughts about watching this film, I assume for the first time?
Yeah, well, I saw this film for the first time, but many parts of the discussion I've always witnessed from my older cousins because they were very politically active. But one of the most astonishing parts of this is what they were talking about then in 1972 is still unresolved, and those are our biggest complaints today. So to me, the lesson is, what have we not done between 1972 and 2021 that keeps us in the same position? So for me, I mean, that speech from Jesse Jackson, that's probably the best speech he had ever given. And if that Jesse Jackson was still Jesse Jackson today, I mean, he would fire up all of the youth like he did back then.
I agree. In doing some research on the film, I was watching an interview between the director's son, David, and one of the persons who actually helped produce the event. And he was saying that was really the speech that broke Jesse Jackson. So, I mean, as well, that's a lightning bolt. I kind of wish I still had that Jesse Jackson. I know he's out there somewhere, but now I'm looking at who's the next person. So, Darlene McDonald, what are your thoughts on the film?
Replicate him a few thousand times. Replicate that Jesse Jackson a few thousand times to get that speech out there. Yeah.
I agree. We need that. Darlene, your thoughts?
I would love to replicate that Jesse Jackson 2,000 times. Unfortunately, many of them end up not being with us anymore. We have a history of assassinations in this country, so I would be very worried for that next Jesse Jackson. When I watched this film also for the first time, it really made me think about our political capital as African-American political capital and recognizing that. And they absolutely recognized that in the film and was speaking to that political capital. And it wasn't being devoted to a particular political party as well, because you have issues with both parties. The African American has issues with the Democratic Party as well as issues with the Republican Party. So it wasn't like they were trying to be completely obedient to any one party. So, but speaking to political capital, so that's really was my biggest takeaway from the film, and recognizing that, and as James was saying, also recognizing that in the times that we're in right now, because we came back to that, especially in the 2020 election, and really just pushed hard on our political capital to be able to change the political landscape. And we see some of the repercussions of that in state legislatures of what's trying to happen as a result of African Americans really showing up to vote in 2020 and expending that political capital. So that was my takeaway from that moment and from the film.
Yeah, and it really is a powerful one. It 1 in 5, as Jesse Jackson says in 1972. You know, that's what a Black American was in relation to the rest of white America, and the representation was just not there, nor was the requisite power and access to power. So being able to really make sure capital was applicable was something that was extremely important. To continue on the theme of capital, Byron, what were your thoughts about the film?
Well, you know, I kind of saw something that made me realize that there's a sense of hope. And I say that because I thought that those were speeches that were a reflection of a time when you had to really actually do the math. And as Darlene mentioned, the political capital was, if you add up and do the math, that actually emboldens us, but it frightens others. And so I thought, to this point, that I just love the idea that we proved something this last election. And I would say that, you know, that was done, especially in Georgia. And I think that we saw an activity there that was about motivating people to realize that if they actually participated and they did it, there would be some success. And you know, I think that we look at that and we see that example and we think about the importance of storytelling, because this film tells a story that was uncovered about people who were brave. I mean, think about that. I looked in the film and I saw the signs of Utah. I'm just thinking, wow, who were those people who were brave enough to actually show up and actually make a voice? The sign from Utah was there a lot. I was a little suspicious because I didn't see any folks, but I know that they were there. But I think about, you know, some of these great orators and some of these amazing celebrities, but it really is the Stacey Abrams of today that is our absolute blueprint for how we're going to succeed. And with all of the repression, all of the repression of voting rights and all of the idea that these numbers scare people so much that they have to actually cook the books. They have to move the yard line, or whatever you call that. I'm not good with sports. But the actual, to think that we can make that difference, that our numbers, our political capital is there, and that there are people who are allies too, right? It isn't just the fact that we have X amount of Black people in this country, or people of minority status in this country, or multicultural status in this country, but we have people who actually feel that it's the right thing to do. And I think when you have people like Stacey Abrams who prove that if you step up and if you do this, it will actually make a difference, that's the reality of showing that action works and that participation works.
I highly agree. Representative Hollins.
Yeah, so there was two things that stood out to me in this film. Number one is the power and energy that you just felt that was in that room. It was absolutely amazing what was happening in that room, and that all of these people came together from all over the United States, to use their collective voice to try to make a change in this nation. It reminded me when I was in DC once, and I was there for some convention or some meeting, and I decided to get out and take a walk, and ended up in a Black Lives Matter protest while I was there by accident, but wanted to be there just to kind of observe everything that was going on. And when I was there, I remember there was this little man who was standing, he was standing away from me, and somehow he made his way over and was standing right next to me. And of course, he was so much in my space, I couldn't help but talk to him. And I asked him, I said, what's your thoughts on this protest? He said, this is the same energy that I felt when I was here with Dr. King and I marched with him. He says the same energy, and I think these kids are gonna make some change. And so with that, the second thing was the issue piece. And a lot of the issues that they're talking about then we can talk about now. It's the exact same issues. You have people who are feeling disenfranchised by the political system. They feel the political system is not working for them, and so they're urging people to get out and vote the same way, we have been urging people to get out and vote. One of my biggest things is conversations with young people right now who are saying that they feel their vote don't matter. It doesn't matter, and I have to remind them, well, yeah, it matters because people are trying to suppress it. So yes, it's very valuable. That's why all of these suppression laws are occurring. And so a lot of that was the main two things for me. It's just the energy and the same issues, the same battles that we're still fighting today.
I would agree. To kind of set that off, though, one of the things I think is super interesting about the political climate today is that we have this ability that there are more women than we've ever had, or more LGBTQ elected officials than we ever had, Black, if not of other colors, than we've ever had. And it's been really wonderful. One of the things that really stood out to me about Nationtime was the lack of significant screen time for women in the film, particularly any mention of Shirley Chisholm, who was running for president that same year. Can some of the women here speak to their thoughts about that?
Sure, I can speak about it a little bit.
Mhm.
Shirley Chisholm chose to boycott this convention because her own Black colleagues, would not endorse her as she was running for president because they felt that it should have been a Black man who was running on that ticket first. And so I think a lot of this is I want to say it's a reflection of the times then, but some of it is a reflection of the times, things that are happening
Yeah.
right now in our political system. And I could just speak as a Black woman who's on the front line, and who has, we were talking earlier, who don't know her place. Nobody has ever told me what my place is, and I'm crazy enough not to try to find out where my place is. I just got things I want to get done for my community, and so I do whatever I have to do to get those things done. But I think it was just a reflection. I wasn't surprised that. Well, I was surprised that she wasn't there. But when I started doing the history search and find out why she wasn't there,
Hmm.
I understood. And if I was there, I would have been in her corner saying, yeah, we should have been behind her and standing with her.
Yes, I think that's a legitimate response. And as those of us might know, was it George McGovern ended up being the candidate for 1972 and was basically just pretty much annihilated by Richard Nixon that election. So maybe Miss Chisholm should have continued on had the support been there. Darlene, do you have anything to say?
I do. It was good to see the widows of
Mhm.
Dr. King and Malcolm X. And it made me think about, really, we don't know too much about the women who marched alongside Dr. King. We don't know too much about the women who were actually a part of Bloody Sunday with with John Lewis. There were many women, and women were right there at the forefront of the civil rights movement, even starting the Black Panther Party as well. But we don't know too much about them. I got into a conversation today on Twitter, of all places, um, with someone speaking about how ingrained the culture of white supremacy is, that we don't even recognize it even within our own BIPOC community, and how it is also reflective of some of the things that we do, especially how we address the patriarchy, right? And even colorism being a big piece of this as well. And so when you see in this film that the women, although let's look at what happened just this last election cycle, I mean, who really drove this home were Black women. And Black women have really been at the forefront of every single movement, but they're not the ones that are featured, as you see, or the featured speakers are the ones that are really taught about in our history books. We find out about them later. So I think it's incumbent upon us now, to the present day us storytellers, to remember that going forward, that the only way that we are going to dismantle this system that we're saying right now that needs to be dismantled, we have to be mindful and purposeful in everything that we do. And that when we document this and we tell our children and grandchildren and great grandchildren these stories going forward, that we include the women of the movement so that we don't continue to repeat these mistakes.
I highly agree. I couldn't have said it better myself. And I think there is definitely a precedent to do that. And again, to circle back to Stacey Abrams, I think it's very hard to refute that evidence right now of what Black women are bringing to the table and the power that they do wield. I do want to switch gears for a second, kind of talk to James for a moment. James, as the GOP representative, or formerly GOP representative on the panel here, a lot of what was being spoken about during that documentary was not necessarily what was considered the usual talking points or any talking points in regards to the Republican Party at the time. There was a lot of dissension and frustration with both political parties, as we saw in the film. What were your thoughts as a Republican looking at that film with what was being said and the struggle for Black economic and civil rights liberation?
Yeah, well, I have several points, but I want to just put on my Republican hat and refute one thing from my dear friend Darlene. Well, not necessarily.
Uh-oh.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. I can now.
Yeah, okay. Because I kind of grew up in the civil rights era, I can tell you firsthand that especially Black women made a conscious decision and said, we're going to play a support role to Black men because we're fighting against white men. And they knew it was more powerful to have a Black man fight up against a white man than a Black woman. So it wasn't that they were being dismissed. They made a conscious decision to say, how can we get across the finish line? So they were never subservient. They were most certainly the decision makers in many cases. But when it came to the public persona, they knew exactly the most effective way to advance civil rights. So we should make sure we tell that part of the story, because women do that all the time. They make a conscious decision of saying, how do we make sure that this gets across the finish line? So I think that would be a very powerful story to tell. And the reason that I kind of push back against that is because I do not like our community to look through the lens of white feminism, because that's been very destructive to the Black community. So I'll just leave that part there. But on to, if you recall, in the late in the Civil Rights passage, the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, it was Republican senators that pushed for that, and which was a great thing that Democrats came on board. That's an example of what I've been talking about. We have to have our agenda, and we have to push on both sides to make sure it happens. So it's just not really that relevant to me which political party makes it happen. But what's very relevant today is that when we work together as a community of people, we can get our agenda across, whatever that issue is. But we must remember that we have an unpaid debt owed to us by this society, and no one else can understand that part of that unpaid debt. And I'm not talking about reparations. I'm talking about from the founding of this country forward, we're the only people culturally that have been less than a man in law. So there are many ramifications from that. And we cannot sometimes have everyone else's agenda cobbled onto ours for us to get what we need. So on the Republican side, we're very specific about making sure that unpaid debt is addressed specifically to the Black community.
Agreed. I think that is a very salient point. Byron, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but I think storytelling is important, and who tells the story, I think, as Darlene has mentioned and as Representative Hollins has mentioned, is how the story goes. The victors of ancient wars tell the stories, and those who did not survive don't get to. And so I go back to the Film Center telling the story of Dolores Huarte. Everybody knows, everybody believes they know that the story of that movement was Cesar Chavez. When you see this film and you see the story, you recognize that actually Dolores got more done, did more, put herself out there, risked her life, and was just a little too busy to promote herself. And I think that's the point. The point is that we, as men, as women, as Black, as white, as anyone, we need to refer to the storytelling of those who have the experiences while we can. And I really believe strongly that as I saw the film, I, like Representative Hollins too, thought, well, where is the representation? And I think there was a little bit of machismo. And I thought it was interesting that Coretta Scott King, maybe she decided not to speak, stood and just took the crowd's, sort of adoration. And that's respectable. Maybe she chose not to. But again, I think that what we can do as members of this panel, as members of this community, and as supporters of the Utah Film Center, board member, a little biased, is to support the idea of telling stories and promote storytelling through those who can tell the story with authenticity, with honesty, and sometimes a little pain. Because not every story that we look at, every documentary or any film even, is always, sort of a happy ending. It's truth, and truth should actually make us feel a slightly bit uncomfortable, because truth is what makes us better. And I strongly believe that storytelling can help us do that.
I highly agree. Thank you, Byron. Now, this film did debut on NET, which was a national educational television, which was the precursor to PBS. And, it survived some defunding that took place, which took out shows like Soul and other shows that tried to really provide a Black lens to really have the country view Black culture in a different, intelligent, artistic, and cultural unique point of view. Now, this show lived on with Tony Brown as Tony Brown's Journal in 1991, but the show itself, Black Journal, was very, very fascinating because it was able to bring a number of different artists and cultural leaders and political leaders to roundtables and conversations that I've been able to see via YouTube, which has all been super fascinating. But a lot of that history has been obliterated, and it's kind of, diasporatic, if that is a word, in its own regard. And I think what Byron says in regards to what the history is very important, because the history also informs the future as well as the present, but definitely the future, and hopefully those upcoming generations that are really going to take us to better places and have different struggles than the ones we presently have. I think I'm going to throw it out to Miss Betty again. What parallels in political action can you draw between 72 and today in regards to what you saw in this film?
There were numerous parallels, and I know we could have a long discussion around the role of women in patriarchal societies and holdovers from our Christian faith and things of that nature that have always impacted the role that women would have in leadership. And so when we were talking earlier, I just hit on that for a minute. Even with the March on Washington, with Dr. King, Dorothy Height, she was the major architect of that whole movement, but did not speak. And even when us as Black women, for whatever reason, have to take a different role or choose to take a different role, I believe it's up to our men to say, no, don't take that role. I want you by my side, or I want you in front of me on this. You look at Catherine Cleaver, so many in the movement that did a lot of the work, but were not that spokesperson. And I believe that we as women have the capacity and capability to help us get over the finish line, as Sister Stacy showed us recently. So I'm just gonna put a pinpoint there for a minute. But in terms of parallels, I think recognizing what time it is, being able to energize our community, our base again. And that was one of the things that we saw with the Black Lives Matter movement. It energized and revitalized the conversation around race, this social construct that we continue to step over and around and under and all kinds of things, versus dealing with humanity and our role as human beings and how we respect and honor and treat each other. And so I think that's where we are now, to capitalize on that energy of our youth and those that are older in the movement, to help direct that energy to action items so that we can see some results. I think another big parallel was the call for economic empowerment and eliminating that humongous wealth gap that we experience today. And as I think it was, I can't think of the mother's name, Queen Mother, talk about pay us for the work we already did. You're not giving me anything. Mm-hmm. We already did the work, pay up. And why is it that everybody else can get paid except for Black folk? It is beyond me. And then to hear us even having those conversations, you hear leaders like, well, don't have to pay me, don't send me no check. Send me your check, send me their check. Anybody don't want a check, I will take it. Because the best thing we could do for a poor person is not to be poor ourselves. So we can't move this agenda if we don't have the resources, and that includes financial resources. And so that has to be at the top of all of our agendas, is how are we dealing with the economics? How do we build Black businesses? How do we strengthen them? How do we get corporate America to invest in us when, again, they reap the benefits of over 400 years of free labor? And so why should they get, they're not paying income tax like we are, so why should they continue to get these passes economically instead of challenging them to invest in real investment, long-term investment, not a check this week and then we don't see them for 5 years. So this has to be some sustained, committed, and intentional work to raise the bar, to take us from where we are to where we want to go. And I think lastly, the parallel in terms of what activism needs to look like today. People that have different opinions than us end up at the school board meeting. They end up at the legislative session all the time. They get involved in other movements and other organizations to help them have a voice, to utilize their voice. And so I think that's where we are today, is to be able to help each other learn how to use this voice we have, use the power that we have, use the dollars that we currently have, and be intentional about where we're spending our dollars and where we want them to go so that we can make a difference in our own community, because we are financing everybody else but ourselves. And one of the things that Jesse said, we still have this belief that we have to undo a lot of the negative thinking and lessons that we've been taught historically, because oftentimes we do think that white person's water tastes better than someone else's, or white person's ice is colder than a Black person's ice, or the white people's medicine works better than Black people's medicine, when we started it all. It all started in Africa. So they were able to make us think and accept this false narrative about ourselves, and we live that out. So as Jesse said, we got to start with this, and Gil Scott and so many others, freeing our mind. We have to take the shackles off of our mind and read and become knowledgeable about who we are, what we can do, what we have done, and what is going to be required moving forward, because we have all that we need. It's just a matter of how do we organize that, how do we channel that, and being willing to accept leadership in forms and ways that we may not be used to. It might be somebody that's 19. We can't say you too young, what do you know? We have to be willing to look and accept it where it is and use it and make the most of it and build from that.
I think that's a wonderful response. Thank you. I'd like to open it up to everyone else. Do you have thoughts, feelings about the political parallels between 72 and now? Oh,
I guess I'll go. I do. I think one of the things that really hit for me watching the film was the fact that there was no allegiance really to a political party, but at the same time, the Reverend Jesse Jackson would later in the 80s go on to run for president for the Democratic Party. I think that they were very savvy, and I really appreciate this, really just about Black people in general really understand politics. And they also understand our participation in politics. There was a recent survey that came out that measured which group watched the news the most. And evangelical African Americans watch more news than any other group. And I really believe that, because we really truly understand that our lives are dependent upon it. And that has been from 1619, when we landed here, to today, that what happens in the political landscape does impact our lives. So watching that film and seeing that room understand the political capital that they have, but also recognizing the way forward is through the ballot box. That's what they're thinking about. That's what they're talking about. The whole thing was, how we're going to change this is through the ballot box. The revolution is going to be at the ballot box. That's what it was all about. Even if we have to form our own party, which in a two-party system, that's not going to work. But they knew that. They're smart enough to really know that, because Jesse Jackson didn't run on a third-party ticket. He ran for the Democratic Party nomination later on in the 80s. Very savvy, very, very much aware of how politics works. So I really brought that out of the film, and this is today. We know how to make changes today at the ballot box.
Can I add to that also? Also being politically involved. When all of the civil unrest was occurring here, and I had the opportunity to meet our young people, and we had this conversation around politics. And some of them are open to politics, and some of them are, you just part of the problem, you just part of the system. Fine. But having to explain to them, you cannot, part of change comes with making policy changes. And you have to be engaged in order to make those policy changes. Yes, protest, I think, is wonderful. I think peaceful protests and bringing attention to a major issue that is happening is good. Is good because I think we all have a part to play in all of this. Everyone can play a part. For some people, it's out with the protests, and with some of us, it's on the politics end. And I think with both of us pushing, we can make these changes. But having them understand, having people understand that you need to be in the Capitol, you need to be in the rooms, you need to be in your city council, you need to be in your school board meetings where these decisions are being made, because when you're in the room, the conversation changes. You have a chance to voice your opinion about what is happening, and about the policies that are being made. And so I think that is one of the things that I noticed in there. They recognize that. They recognize the power and they vote, but also in policy, knowing that the way they had to change policy is that they had to be in the room and they had to be at the table to be able to make those changes. And I've always said since I've been in office, and James can attest to this, I say one of my goals is to get Black people politically involved in this state. I want them politically involved. I want them up at the Capitol. I want them holding their elected officials accountable for the decisions that they are making that are affecting their everyday lives. And that is what has got to happen in this state. And I think that is one of the ways that we are going to be able to make some changes.
James, do you have any thoughts, parallels, or even just where we go from here?
Well, there are some parallels, but I think I'll focus. I think Darlene and Sandra have hit on those as well as Betty. But I think where do we go from here is the $1 million question. And the way that party politics is now, it has basically become identity politics. You're forced to be in someone's camp. That does not work, in my opinion, for Black folks, especially Blacks that are American descendants of slaves. We have a unique claim, and until that claim is addressed, it's going to be very difficult for us to really achieve parity. Because this is an example I like to use. I and those that grew up on historically Black campuses can attest to this, is that we had this, at the time we didn't realize it, but we grew up in this bubble where all we saw were Black professionals, doctors, lawyers, professors. We went to school from preschool to 8th grade on the campus. So we didn't even recognize this thing that was called discrimination. So our whole character, our worldview was formed. And so when we started to be introduced to the real America, we were able to externalize that and say, that's their problem, that they don't see my value. And that's what Jesse Jackson was talking about. So there's a lot of damage that needs to be mended. And it is happening through what I call identity politics. The moment you tell someone they are this or that because of their accident of birth, their skin color, their gender, or whatever, their gender, it just doesn't, you're setting that person up not to see their own spirit of who they are, and that whatever they can imagine, they can become. And if we can get back to that as a Black community, and getting back to that would mean, in our case, going back 400 years, because that's essentially where we need to go to reclaim our spirit. That is, to me, the journey. That's what we have to start looking at. So I say, forget this Republican, Democrat partisanship and all of that, and stop adopting everybody else's struggle. We have enough of our own that we have to focus on. Forgive me for sounding selfish, but I think after 400 years, we deserve at least a decade where we can work on ourselves. And I have to worry about everybody else's challenges. So that's just kind of where I'm at.
Thank you, James. And Byron, for closing thoughts, where do we go from here?
Oh, what pressure. Oh my gosh. I think we should close with somebody with a lot more insight than I do. But I do think that we do have a lot of challenges and we demand a lot of our leaders. We go to the ballot box. And one thing that I tend to see a lot of is that we actually have an energy to say we want justice for this, or we want funding for that, or we want rights for this. And sometimes we get it. Sometimes there are things that pass, whether it's a hate crimes bill, whether it's, conversion therapy going away, whether it's, chokeholds being instituted. And I think that we have some amazing and brave, sometimes, controversial, but a lot of times hardworking individuals who work for us. They are our representatives. They are our senators. They are our leaders. And I think that someone like Representative Hollins, I've seen her work. I know what it takes to make tough decisions. And I think sometimes we don't spend enough time saying thank you. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for making this happen. Because it's like it's like bird flying in the sky. It's, we just kind of get distracted and then we go to the next fight. And if our leaders don't know that we are going to thank them for what we ask for and we receive it, then it's going to be a little difficult for that sense of reward. And finally, I just wanted to say that I want to thank the people who watched this today. I want to thank the people who actually spent time to look at something that would enlighten them, that they didn't know before, that made them more informed, that gave them a greater sense of this is how you do it, this is what is possible, and this is what we should be doing. And sometimes telling that story is what's gone through the time of history, that we tell stories and we tell them for a reason. Homer told a story and it was actually remembered and recited, and it was so important that the Greek state actually employed people to tell the story. They literally had them on the payroll. And I think we need to recognize that telling those stories is so important because it makes us recognize what is given to us. And sometimes we need to appreciate that. We need to appreciate the work. We need to say, thank you, Representative Hollins. Thank you, Mayor so-and-so, or thank you, City Council person, individuals, and make sure that we do the fight, we go for the battle. When we win, we have to say thank you. And a lot of times we have a lot of other things in line, but say thank you first and then say, well, we want more. And I think that's really important. And again, thank you, Russell, and thank you, Josh, for making this possible. You really have done the ultimate job in outreach. You've reached out to us. Miss Betty, thank you for pulling us in and bringing us here and identifying people who you respect. And I just can't thank you enough for being capable of being on the honor with being such great people amongst me. And I really appreciate what the Film Center does. I don't know if you all know, and the audience knows this, but the Film Center does these at no cost. You don't have to pay. We do, almost 200 screenings, maybe I got the numbers wrong, at no cost. And that is something that I think is a treasure. And I think tonight has been an example of that. So thank you.
Thank you, Byron. And thank you to everyone else that's joined this evening. James, Sandra, Betty, Darlene. It was a wonderful conversation. And thank you again, Byron. That makes the end of our conversation, the post-film discussion for Nationtime. Thank you out there for joining us this evening. It's been a wonderful talk, and I hope you've learned something. Stick around for our film tomorrow, Amazing Grace, which is part of our Black, Bold, and Brilliant program for our film night. And I'd like to say special thanks to the Utah Juneteenth Festival and Betty Sawyer for making this happen this evening. So everyone have a good night, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.